evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a virtual roundtable discussion on Indigenous representation in colonial institutions presented by Friends of Royal Alberta Museum Society, FRAMS for short. My name is Whyrepresentation, and I am the president of FRAMS. Some of you may be familiar with our society, but those of you who are not, FRAMS is a registered charity and not-for-profit member organization that promotes and supports the Royal Alberta Museum through various funding initiatives, programs, and acquisitions and gifting of various artifacts and pieces. If you wish to learn more about FRAMS, please visit frams.ca. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items that we need to take care of. Closed captioning will be automatically enabled, and there's an option to deactivate it along the bottom of the menu bar. The Q&A function during this presentation will be disabled, and we will not be having a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. The chat function will also be disabled. If you have any technical issues, please email info@frams.ca. As we begin the official part of our presentation, we would like to recognize that we are webcasting from and to many different parts of Alberta today and Canada. The province of Alberta is located on Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8 territory and is a traditional meeting ground and home for many Indigenous peoples. FRAMS respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional and ancestral gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Dakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others. We acknowledge the many First Nation, Métis, and Inuit who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations. We are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are visiting. Acknowledging traditional territory is one part of recognizing and moving beyond colonization and strengthening a relationship in a positive way. We honor and respect the history, languages, ceremonies, and culture of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who call this territory home. I would now like to introduce Elaine Alexie. Elaine is the Curator of Indigenous Studies at the Royal Alberta Museum and will be our moderator for this evening's event. Elaine, the floor is yours.
Masi Cho, thank you, Ravi. Nakwan Juktrincho Othli, Jinsakwinzi Chalaknai, Elaine Alexie Vaji, Tetlache Kwichin Dichu. Thank you, everyone. I am very happy to be here this evening, and I thank you all for joining this panel discussion. As Rav introduced, my name is Elaine Alexie. I am a member of the Tetlakwitchin First Nation from Fort McPherson, Northwest Territories, and I'm the Curator of Indigenous Studies at the Royal Alberta Museum, and I am your host for tonight's evening. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge where I am speaking from tonight. I am speaking from the traditional territories from Amiskwichi Wiskagan, which is named in English Beaver Hills House, otherwise known as Edmonton, Alberta, in Treaty 6 territory, which is also the Nehiwak Nakota Sioux lands and homeland of the Métis Nation. I have the great honor to moderate this incredible roundtable discussion featuring Indigenous scholars and curators, which is entitled Unsettled, Indigenous Representation in Colonial Institutions. Colonialism has deep roots in North America and around the world. Colonial institutions like museums and universities needs to change in order to better reflect Indigenous realities and experiences, including the communities they represent, how they want to be seen by the world. Again, I welcome you to this virtual space to participate by listening and reflecting with your heart and your mind on these important topics we will soon be discussing together. The aim of the event this evening is to broadly unpack the following questions. What responsibilities do cultural and post-secondary institutions have in telling Indigenous stories? Who exactly should be involved in the telling of these stories? What shifts are required to make this happen? I would like to now formally invite to this virtual space Dr. Miranda Roberts, Dr. Paul Guerrero, and Mrs. Felicia Garcia. Welcome, everyone. Please introduce yourselves, and I would like to just shift it over to Miranda. Can you start us off?
Yes, thank you so much, Elaine. It's so nice to be here. Hello, everybody. My name is Miranda Roberts. I'm an enrolled member of the Yerington Paiute tribe, which is in Nevada, as well as Chicana, which is local to Los Angeles. I would like to acknowledge that right now I'm currently on the homelands of the Luiseño, Cahuilla, Digüeño, Gabrielino, sorry, and Tongva territory. I am currently the postdoctoral researcher at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, but I just got a new position as the education manager at the Museum of Us, which is in San Diego and Kumeyaay territory, and I am very excited to be there and hopefully have a great conversation.
Thank you, Miranda. Paul?
Hello, Tansei Kiawao. Bonjour, everyone. My name is Paul Guerrero. I'm currently in Edmonton. I'm a Wisconsin, like as Elaine said, but I'm Métis from a small town called Bellevue near Batoche, Saskatchewan, on Treaty 6 in Métis homeland, and I'm very happy to be here. So my role too, as I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Native Studies, but my role is also as the person in charge, the main gardener for the Indigenous Canada MOOC. So I take care of the Indigenous Canada MOOC, which has 350,000 learners who are very active, and it's a very popular course right now. So that's what we do in our faculty, and that's why I'm here in this really amazing museum place. So thank you very much, Elaine Masicho, for inviting me here. I'm very honored to be here with Miranda and Felicia. Merci.
Merci, Paul.
Yeah.
All right, and I guess I'll go next. Haku Matuka Felicia Garcia, Samala Shumash no ni Kasho iti. Hello, my name is Felicia Garcia. I'm Samala Shumash, originally from San Ynez, California. That's where my ancestral homelands are. And I'm very happy to be here with you all today. I'm a guest in another community's territory. I am privileged to live and work in Ogopoge, which means White Shell Water Place, otherwise known as Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is Tewa territory. I am the curator of education at the School for Advanced Research's Indian Arts Research Center. I would also describe myself as an independent museum scholar, and Miranda and I host a podcast together. It's called Exhibiting Kinship, and together we focus on the many ways that Indigenous people are working to radically change the museum world. So Kakinash, thank you so much, Elaine, for inviting me to be here today.
Welcome. I am so incredibly excited, and you know, this has been a conversation in the making, and like I follow when I first start thinking about, you know, these topics, you know, who better than to approach Miranda and Felicia about this, just because of what you girls are doing right now, and your expertise and your experiences to lend and help, you know, us foster a really strong conversation that is so much needed here north of the border. I guess so, just to get right into it, we've seen some pretty dramatic shifts within the last year, and you know, nothing COVID related. A lot of societal shifts, you know, in the way BIPOC, Indigenous folks are really raising the bar in terms of, you know, better representation, you know, better ways to be present within colonial systems. So why does representation matter for Indigenous peoples and people of color when considering colonial institutions? And I just like to direct this to whoever would like to go first.
Okay, I guess I will. So I think, well, and again, I would like to emphasize, I can only speak for myself. I'm not speaking on the behalf of any community or individual. It's important just to situate that what I talk about is from what I've experienced in colonial institutions. But for me, representation matters because these museums and academia, but when I'm talking, it's mostly about museums, have been sites of immense misrepresentation of Indigenous people for centuries. They've been sites where our cultural items have been taken and stolen from us, or including our human remains, for study, for science, for things that have no real, I guess you could say, reasoning in our own communities. There was no reason for, these types of practices to be happening. And so we've been misrepresented and mischaracterized, misidentified, just kind of having our cultures up for grabs and tokenized and romanticized, to the point where visitors, non-Indigenous, non-First Nations people don't even know who we really are, don't know our real histories. They don't know our real struggles, our real successes. They've only been given so much of our history, and usually it's from white anthropologists. And so why our representation matters, because it's our turn to be able to tell our stories in a way that represents our communities and our voices, that is no longer screened by anthropologists or scientists. Or I think for me also, representation matters because it affects how others directly treat us, right? So if they're able to see better representations of who we are, what we've overcome, then they'll be able to treat us with a much more, I want to say, sense of respect, sense of compassion, and sense of understanding that I think that has been lacking with our community for so long by non-Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yes. Oh, sorry, Paul, did I cut you off?
I'm just thumbs up for everything.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, Miranda. I also just wanted to add, I have a background in psychology. That's what my undergraduate degree is in. And as an undergrad, I conducted research on the psychological impact of mascots and stereotyped imagery, and primarily reading the research of Dr. Stephanie Freiberg, an Indigenous psychologist. And, a lot of what I read was extremely disheartening. These kinds of stereotyped images have a severely detrimental effect on Native youth, particularly. But a lot of the literature suggested that the impact of these kinds of stereotypes is only magnified because we don't have many positive or accurate representations of ourselves in society. And so if we had accurate and positive representations in places like museums, the impact of these stereotyped images might not be as impactful. And so museums not only affect the way that society sees us as Indigenous people, but the way that we see ourselves. And so there's a lot of power there for these institutions to do good and to affect change.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. If I could add to that, it's also, making space and room for, other people, other professionals, such as yourself. Like, I'm thinking, when I would go to museums younger, what a difference it would make to see an Indigenous person in these places, and not just walking the halls, but, like just everywhere. I think that is an element to it that really adds to, why representation matters. It just makes a world of difference if you see your own people in places that you willingly feel like you belong there, that it's inclusive. That presence makes such a difference.
Yeah, so I guess for me, not being a museum person, but we grew up growing up in where I did near Batoche. The Batoche Museum sort of overtook what was our place, in terms of like Métis of Batoche area, and it became the center point for the whole area for us to, the museum sort of was this intersecting point for us to go back to these places where our ancestors visited all the time. So it's a really strange relationship I have with museums, I guess, because it was always this curation of culture and relations where I wanted to not have that in terms of our visiting, that sort of intermediate force. So it's funny how this, like as an academic in Native studies, in our faculty, which is an independent faculty of Indigenous Studies, it's about self-determination and sovereignty, right? And I feel like that's been the biggest gift I've had coming into this institution in U of A, is that sovereignty is put first amidst all of the dynamics of settler colonialism. And it's been a really wonderful, I've told you this a few days ago, it's been such a wonderful experience to be able to be free to think this way, talk this way, and it's almost, yeah, it's a very freeing kind of way of being, because settler colonialism was so implicit and so explicit in terms of like stopping that self-determination, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's so much fun to hear this, talking about this in the museum context, like to be like, how do we center self-determination and sovereignty of Indigenous nations and other peoples, right? Human and more than human. So it's really cool.
Just to put it into context for some of our audience members, the Faculty of Native Studies is, correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but the largest in North America in terms of faculty size and staff. I'm assuming, I don't know, you got to correct me on the numbers, like there's 28 staff and majority of them Indigenous. And have like undergrad programs and graduate programs. And so it's just like in terms of the Indigenous number and representation at a place like the U of A, it's significant, it's huge.
Yeah, and I can't count to save my life, so I love your numbers. Your numbers are good, Elaine. So yeah, it's a really special place where Indigenous and non-Indigenous students can sort of like center Indigenous epistemologies and center Indigenous ways of thinking and doing and researching, and hey, relational ethics. Like it's a beautiful gift. That a lot of people can engage in on multiple levels. So it's this intersectionality that happens in a independent place, so as independent as we can be, right? So yeah, it's a fantastic place. Everyone's invited. We love it so much. I'm gonna be tooting that horn all day. Yeah.
So my next question, in terms of framing that, leading on from why representation matters. Well, what does Indigenous curation mean to you? Which this also can include storytelling and academic research. And how do you make room for collaboration in your work? Miranda, let's start with you.
Sorry. This is like something I think about a lot, probably almost every day, is Indigenous curation. Well, I think any institution, especially if it's not one that's ran tribally, but like a tribal museum or a tribal college, I'm talking like the large colonial institutions, really need to make space and room for Indigenous people to have a seat at the table in much more of a way than just having like a PhD or a master's. There needs to be internal assessment done by every large institution on what does it mean to actually have a diversity statement, but then also actually implementing it and actually going forward and doing the work that is needed to work with these communities that the institutions want to work with in a way that doesn't produce more harm and more trauma for the people that they're bringing in. And so for me, Indigenous curation means making space to listen to what is needed by the curator in terms of like resources for gifts, resources for proper ways of displaying cultural items, proper ways of conservation, proper ways of maintaining those cultural items while they're situated in the collection. It also means indigenizing some of the language that is in place for registration, for the system, the cataloging system. It means going out into community and actually seeing how people live and work. And I think one thing when I say that is like, why should I go watch other people? And it's not just to be like an anthropologist. It's not to be an anthropologist at all. It's to be, because I think that there's this idea that Native people, like, they don't want us around. They don't, like, how do we even engage in conversation And it's like, well, go talk to people, go learn from them, go engage with them, go to their cultural events that everyone is welcome to, and start asking questions, and be okay with making mistakes and saying the wrong thing and getting maybe yelled at, because that's going to happen. There's a lot of hurt in our communities and a lot of anger. But if you don't put yourself out there like that, then you're not going to be able to really appreciate the work that we're all trying to do here, and how important it is for all of us. So for me, Indigenous curation, I can put up all of the beautiful paintings done, but unless the institution is really dedicated to helping the communities that they've stolen so many items from, and ideas and things like that, then they're not really wanting to do the work of collaboration. They just want things that are done easy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just following
This
up.
doesn't mean I'm going to talk. Sorry.
I love it. I love the thumbs up. I was going to do the reaction here on my little Zoom, but I couldn't find it. So I'll have to stick with the original thumbs up. But just following up on that, I think it's so important that we make space for lived experiences and the expertise that comes with that. As you're saying, Miranda, a lot of times, or for a long time, museums have only respected the opinions of people who are educated in these colonial Western institutions, and respected the perspective of non-Native people who are supposedly experts on Indigenous people and our way of life. You know, when there is an elder out there who is more of an expert than anyone else could ever be on their own culture and their own community. And I think that we just need to make space and respect that there are different types of experts and different types of knowledge, and one isn't better than the other just because it comes from a colonial institution.
Mm-hmm.
Right on. Elaine? Are we doing this?
Well, I think if I were to add to what was shared, my approach to curation, is really centered on relationships. And, it embodies an approach that really centers voices and community in a way that I feel, for me, it's helping communities tell their stories in a way that they would like to see fit, that how they would like, people to see themselves. But also, underlying that, it's much more than just, creating exhibits and putting things on display. It's about the relationships that I make along the way. It's a lifelong commitment. And I kind of see it as the same approach or methodologies that I use in my research, as an independent researcher, academic researcher. It's the same way that I approach like curating, because it's really centered on the relationships I build on the way. And I feel that's really most important. And I think it also is applied to my colleagues, my work, my non-Indigenous colleagues. The types of relationships I want to embody throughout all my work is both inclusive of not just Indigenous peoples and communities, but also settlers, and helping them to be on a path to be better allies. That's how I kind of see it, and I think it's just the most huge part of what I do is that type of collaboration work. That's what I call for every time. I can't absolutely do this work without community. So.
Mm-hmm. I think I always think about visiting and how important visiting is to my work as an academic, my work, and then my life as a Métis person. It's like visiting is all I want to do. It's like it's my religion, It's just like, and I wish that museums were more engaging spaces of visiting, that instead of a curation of objects and observers, it would be these places where we can all sit together and have a party together, like, because party is such an important part of how we visit and how we see each other. There's a great article by Cindy Gadet called Q Kewin, which is like the Cree Métis, way of visiting, the visiting way. And God, that article totally blew me away because it spoke to like it gave voice to all of these central like this ethic that I've always been drawn to, and it's just like, yeah, we need to visit more. We need to make a place to visit more. Museums should be visiting places, and it excites me now just to think about. I have a cousin who worked at Rams, Chantal Denis, and she brought me behind to see these Métis artifacts, right? And we were just sitting there going like, what are we doing here? What are we doing? And we just started to visit with these artifacts, and the you know, I don't know, Elaine, but they became like relatives, though they are not beaded materials, or they're not like, you know, it's like these things that our communities have put their spirits in and their hearts and their souls in. It's like these artifacts also need to be visited with, you know? So it really affected me, this idea that museums are not places for visiting at all. And that, you know, I would love for that to change. That'd be a really fun thing to do, because we don't have any visiting places, right? We can't go to the mall to visit. You know, they'll tell us to shut up and leave, you know? It's like those kinds of things. So yeah, for sure.
That makes me think of Paul. That's really great, and something that made, and what Elaine was saying too, the relationships, but then also extending that to the museum has to buy into those relationships too, right? Like they can't just rely on us, like Felicia, Paul, or Elaine, to be like, okay, now do everything for us and say it's a checkbox, so you know, we're checking the box. Like they actually need to learn about the communities that they are learning, like they want to put out on display, do their own historical research, how they have been harmed, how the museum has harmed them. And, you know, actually hold space for, like you're saying, for these visits to happen in a way that isn't so sterile and like almost clinical. Like how you're saying, like we laugh, we cry, we cuss, we party, we and we should be able to do that with the items that are stored in these spaces, because they are right communities, right? So yeah.
I think what is touched upon is like that understanding of relationship in a different way. You know, for us, some of us, you know, we talk about it as kinship. You know, we are kin to many different things. We're kin to the land. We have a relationship to it. We have relationships to the river, to, you know, the landscape, to communities. But extending that to actual physical objects too, for some communities, you know, what is housed in museum collections are actually extensions of their ancestral culture. And that understanding is like, I think is really, I'm not going to say missing, but it's misunderstood deeply. That artifacts is an extension of these kind of relationships that families need to maintain. If not families, it's community members. So it's like talking about relationality that is just all interconnected. For you, Paul, how do you make space for that type of approach in your work? You know, how do you center relationships, relationality in your thinking and your work?
Yeah, it's everything, Elaine? So it's like a central ethic to everything that I do. It's everything that my colleagues do. It's part of our discipline of Indigenous studies and Native studies. And I think that's a really amazing thing. It's like it pushes, relationality helps us think that to resist colonialism and resist that institutionalization, those taxonomies, that all these things that we're struggling against, being boxed in, being behind glass and all these things. I find relationality is such a great way to like flex our way of push back against that and center the flourishing of our Indigenous communities, right? So our nations and also our peoplehood relations, right? Because that's the thing too, that what I love about visiting is that we're visiting for ourselves, but for each other, right? And I love that so much. And that these museums, those items also want to be visited with, right? So for me, like they want to hear our voices, they want to hear us laugh, they want to, you know, they want to drink as well. They just want to, you know, eat food and like, you know, have a fun time. And like, yeah, relationality for me, it's like it's part of the way that we think in terms of ethics, research, right? So pushing back against like exploitative and extractive research, right? Like Adam Godry speaks about really well. Like all these, it's really a center point for how we work as academics, but it also reflects how our communities work, right? But that's the hardest thing, is like, how do you instigate this ethic of relationality in a university institution when it's always about, you know, Cartesian or Western Enlightenment values and all these things? And it's a really great, I find it's a really, really liberating way of thinking that helps push back against that hegemony of Western thinking and, you know, that Cartesian duality and all these different aspects of it. So yeah, it's everything I do. It's how I organize my research projects. It's how I think. It's how I talk. It's how I my pedagogy when I teach. It's such a great sort of central ethic, this central ethos of our work, right? And all of us too, as Indigenous people and museologists, right? So.
Mm-hmm. Is there a project that you could point to as an example?
Yeah, I guess I could talk about my project. So I do research. I am like the PI of a group of Métis researchers who are looking at Lac Saint Anne, which is this Catholic pilgrimage site outside of Edmonton, and it's a long-standing visiting place where, you know, multiple nations, Dene, you know, Blackfoot, Cree, Métis, all come together every year for an annual pilgrimage. So our engagement with relationality, in terms of understanding the religiosity of this place, of Lac Saint Anne, it really helps. Relationality helps me think that these aren't places for Catholic institutionalization, but a place for visiting, for nationhood visiting, and for peoplehood visiting. And that has really, like, all of us as Métis scholars in this circle of researchers, has really expanded the way we think about this place. It's like, the way that I see it is that it's this gravity well of visiting that people just keep coming back to because it draws you in, and then you go home, right? And like, it's like, that's what sacred sites are all about. It's like, that's totally linked to museums, right? Like, objects are pulled out of these sacred places and storied places and put into sterile environments that can't continue being made sacred. And yeah, it's so to think differently is to think through relationality in a funny way. So yeah. So that's the research we're doing. It's called the Métis Kinscapes Project. And for me, we're doing this here. I also want to do it at home. I want to do it across the Métis homeland and think about our nation, but our peoplehood relations with the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, you know, like all these different nations coming together in these places.
Amazing.
Mm-hmm.
What you really said resonated with me, Paul, about relationality kind of existing in opposition to colonial ways of doing things. It's similar to academia, or I guess academia within museums. I think there's just a lot of competition and there is a hierarchy that exists. And I found that working in museums and having so many wonderful Indigenous colleagues, for the most part, like, we operate or try to operate outside of that as much as we can. And there is just this incredible network that Miranda and I have built of people who are just supportive, who are constantly offering each other ideas, suggestions, just an ear to listen to, and then lifting each other up and recommending each other for different opportunities, supporting their work. And I think that that is an incredible way to support relationality within museums, is to you know, just continue to practice that kinship that you mentioned, Elaine, that is so ingrained within our communities. And you know, this conversation, I think, is a great example of that. And we really try to also be a good example on our podcast. And you know, so far it's just created a really amazing community.
Definitely. And I will say some of my experience with this is interesting because I co-curated a show with Nina Sanders, who's of Salaga, Crow Nation from Montana. And it all kind of fell into my lap, really, not weirdly, but when I first met a series of the items that were being put out on display, the war shields, which are sacred to them, to the Apsalaga community, I met them when they were being looked at by these white researchers who were putting pictures of them into a book with, I think they had tribal permission from like one person. And these pieces are very powerful and very significant spiritually. And the way that they were being looked at was very clinical and scientific. And I didn't know what they meant at the time, but I could tell from like what my practices are that they shouldn't be talked about in those ways, or like it was making me uncomfortable. And so when I met Nina, who speaks her language, and then her whole family, I'll never forget when we walked into the collection space of her speaking her language loudly through the whole collection space, saying like, I'm here to look at my ancestors, but I'm also here respecting all of the other ancestors that are here. I bring goodwill and a good heart. And then speaking to each of those shields in her language and talking to them, and me touching them and crying, and then bringing her family in, and having to make sure that the people on the project that we were working with knew the cost of this type of work, because it's not just, oh, we collected it and then now those people are no longer around. Like, no, we could trace those things to specific families who then visited them. And it's my responsibility as a non-Apsalia person to make sure that this museum was doing right by them, because they don't understand that relationship. It's like, why can't they just let us do our job as a museum? Because, we know how to put on exhibits, right? Like, we know how to put everything together, but if you don't take the time to spiritually get to know these things and these individuals, then you're not really getting the full understanding of a community or culture. And I think that as a curator, I like to say I'm a facilitator. I can get a story together, but I can't be the one, like you said, Elaine, to tell the story. I have to have that done by community members. I can tell them how it looks on a text panel, but I can't say what those words should look like or what they should mean or anything like that. And it takes a lot of hard work for museums to see that. I think they sometimes romanticize it too. Our spirituality, they romanticize it, and our relationality to each other. So it's a lot of working pieces, but I know with the Indigenous network, like Felicia was saying, that has been my saving grace.
So it takes a lot of diplomacy, right? Like, and I think what's lacking with non-Indigenous people is that a lack of recognition of their own identity or nationhood relations, right? It's just we're empty vessels. We are just Canadian, or we're just American. So I had this one experience where we did this theater performance, and we had asked people in the group who are like non-Indigenous people mostly. I said, who do you recognize and who recognizes you? And I was like, oh, no problem, let it talk my thing. And then no one had an answer for it, right? Because there's no point of reference of being like, oh, well, how can I be a person that is in diplomatic relations with you, and actually recognizes the territory that you have deep relations in and all these things, right? So there's a lack of that self-reflexivity of settler society, and a capacity for diplomacy and taking that seriously, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And extending that, like, I think it's also adding to that, it's that layer of process. It's that layer of, how things are run in a museum. There's a certain way of doing things, but at the same time, when you're working with a community, it's a totally different timeline. They run on their own time. And if you want to take the time to build meaningful relationships with them, well, you have to get on their time. They're not going to stop their time for you. So what I mean by time, it's like, it's not just engagement, it's like the relationships and, them willing to work with you in a way that fosters how they best see fit. So I think it's all that, and also learning how to really, a lot of this stuff is really, really hard work, not just, as Indigenous curators alone, but it's just, extending that to our allies and say, look, you need to put in the work too. You need to put in the work to really understand and how that's an extension of privilege, white privilege, and being in this spaces sometimes feel very violent in a way that's, not, I'm not talking physical violence. It's just like that erasure that it's just, it's heavy. Sometimes it does feel heavy. One of the things I want to share, before doing the role that I'm in, I've been doing museum research for about 10 years, like independently, doing my own work, visiting collections. So I kind of find that every time I went to different institutions, I kind of see how they are, not, just how receptive they've been to me, or, it really varied from place to place. And I went to this one particular place I'm not going to name. It took me a while to go there, to organize getting there, and this visit was really important for me. But when I get there, it's just very unfriendly, very cold rooms, bad lighting, and speaking with the person who was working there, who I was with that day, was just like, every time I spoke about something that I was looking at relating to my people, and my knowledge of, my material culture from my region, this person refuted me each way. And, it could have been this, it could have been that, or this way, it's probably, you're not thinking about this way. And I just couldn't believe it. Like, I was just like, wow. It just blew me away that, it's still like that. And, in where things are right now. So, going to places, I could tell a lot about, their policies, their welcoming mat, so to speak. Miranda, you touched upon something really important that I think, text and labels, and the way that communities want to communicate through their own words. In terms of what type of action or best practices, this is a question for all of you. What best practices do you draw upon to better reflect Indigenous knowledge systems or philosophies, or ways of knowing within your own work?
Yeah, I think, and really quickly, all of those are really interesting things. But when you were talking, Elaine, one thing I was thinking about is everyone who's listening, if they're not Indigenous or they're not from enslaved descendants of enslaved labor, at least in the States, have all benefited from the erasure of Indigenous people and have been complicit in it. And so that's something, if you're not Indigenous to this land, or if you have a background that is infused with slavery, you've benefited from our removal and our genocide. And it's time to get right with understanding what that means and what that looks like and how to freaking change it, right? Because I think that that's where we're all kind of pissed off with, in terms of everything that's going on in the news, is that people are still not understanding how they have been complicit in hiding this history and hiding these stories, rather than acknowledging them. And in text labels at the field right now, we're working with over 100 people, but we've asked our collaborators to write the labels, or to give us their stories instead. And then our developers will go and just make it so it's accommodating for the structure that the museum has, because we couldn't fix everything. I don't necessarily like the way that the labels look, even just physically, but it's the first time that collaborators have been able to write their own labels. And then they're also in native languages if they're able to translate it that way. And then they're translated into Spanish and then they're so we've had to fight though for certain labels that have more than 70 words, or if, to have more of a longer one, because some Indigenous words, as we know, are long. They take up multiple spaces rather than just one little word meaning one thing. So what I've just been trying to do is just sticking as true as we can to what the storyteller has communicated to us, and making sure that it's placed above everything else, rather than the museum speaking for them. But that could be that was also a hard sell in the beginning.
Something I think about a lot also is exactly what you said, Elaine, is that when you're working with Indigenous communities, you have to understand that you're working on their time and you need to accept their way of doing things. I think that in terms of best practices, museums and people who work in these spaces need to surrender authority and be open to new ways of doing things. And you know, that might mean that a project that you would like to get done in a month is going to take a year. I'm working on a project, or I was working on a project where we invited community collaborators, and the very first thing we did was have a meal. You know, it wasn't anything fancy. We ordered a bunch of pizzas and sat around and got to know each other. And then we invited community members to come in and visit the collections as many times as they'd like. We didn't restrict them to just the one piece or a couple pieces they were writing about. We let them, you know, visit with whichever pieces they wanted to in the collection and respected their time and, you know, let them have that time in that space and supported them to begin writing when they were ready. And I think that's really important, to develop relationships and to be open to new timelines and new ways of doing things and new collaborations. I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking that, you know, as you were talking, Felicia, that for those of us that, you know, are investing in building important relationships with other Indigenous peoples and communities, you know, it doesn't run on a 9 to 5 clock, you know, it runs after 5 o'clock, it runs on the weekend, it runs on the holidays. So I think showing investment in that way too really shows the community that you genuinely care, that you genuinely want to you know, be a part of their community. And what I mean by being a part of their community, it's, you know, helping them do what you need to do for them in your capacity. So yeah, I was just thinking about that as you were mentioning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we have to resist the adage that time is money. You know, why do we say that? Why do we love that so much? Time is money. That's so dumb. Time is not money. It's um so yeah, like it's I find, like, just to keep it simple, like the best research I do is when the community is resonating with what I'm doing. So like, you know, Elaine, so many times you get refuted or, like, you know, possessed by people and their knowledge of you and of your way of thinking. And oh my God, the Métis are nonstop, like, trying to assert our own way of thinking and doing, and like resisting like anybody talking for us all the time. It's a national fact for us, I think. And it's funny, like, okay, that always happens, this like power on us. But whenever I do research about things that I care about, I see the Métis in the room really resonating. And for me, that is a spiritual reciprocity, you know, like that means that we're talking about things that is deeply ancestral and deeply relevant, you know. And I really love that. I love it. So that happens at any time, you know, but it happens when we're together, right? So yeah,
Mhm.
that's
bring
good
up,
practices.
yeah, you bring up a really great point, Paul, because like, you know, at the end of the day, you may have a really great idea and a really great project in mind, and you want to get on the road and do it, but you know, the community will need to embrace it too. They need to be ready.
Yep.
They need to be willing to be on the other side of that. So that's a really important consideration.
And like, I think too, with settlers, but the way settler society works is that they're always looking for a spokesperson. And you can't be, you know, Miranda, the way you spoke about at first is like, you can't be a spokesperson for anyone. You are a person embedded in relations, of multiple relations with humans, more than humans. Like, this is part of the way things are, right? So how can you speak for anyone when there's so much weight to the community that you're from and the communities that intersect together in these places, right? Like Edmonton is all of these nations coming together, you know, like at the museum, you know, like, so there's a lot of space that we need to make, a lot of place for these different communities to be recognized and to recognize each other, right? So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Along those same lines, I feel like a lot of times people at museums just want to reach out to a community for like a quote. They want that spokesperson to write a label. and that's it. But I think collaboration, it needs to be like an existing mutually beneficial relationship that's ongoing. It doesn't start at the beginning of an exhibition and end when that exhibition closes. I think that's something a lot of museums need to come to terms with, is that Indigenous people might not want to work with them. They might not want to offer them a quote or write that label or offer consultation on their collection. There needs to be a lot of work put in to develop those relationships before a community wants to work with you. And I think that is really important.
Mhm.
I hear you. Yeah, and I think that's a good point to bring up, Felicia, because I've known that, and Elaine, when you're talking about your experience, I've worked with people who are like that, very, like, well, I've studied this beadwork for 30 years and therefore I know, and I've found that some of the people who I've worked with in the past, when someone who's Indigenous shows any sort of quote unquote negative emotion, right? If they're sad, if they're pissed, if whatever, the person in charge usually turns against them, like, oh, they were rude to me, I don't want to work with them, I don't want to do that with this Indigenous person. And in my head, it's, you don't get the right to decide who you get to work with or not, who's Indigenous, if you're not inducing some sort of emotion from somebody, then you're not doing your job. And also for us in the States, the NAGPRA, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, people are coming in and looking at ancestors who were stolen from their homelands. And so there's going to be a lot of anger, there's going to be a lot of crying, and there's going to be a lot of hurt feelings, but that doesn't mean that museums they're too difficult. You don't get to make those decisions, or the museum doesn't get to make those decisions. So it needs to be a lot more sympathy and compassion from individuals who hold those types of positions, rather than being just because they can, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You reminded me of that, there's that trope about the angry woman or the angry Native woman, and it's like, it's just really, it's very dismissive, when people go there, just because they don't understand it's the complexity of the things that's entangled in museums or colonial institutions. Like, there's so much that we, I'm not going to say up against, there's so much barriers that we work with already. To add that as a dismissive remark or attitude, it doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help the situation. It doesn't help advance, our presence in trying to make change. So that's really important. And yeah, I'm that angry Native woman. So I'm proud of that.
I have her, she is me.
Love it.
So I want to be able to shift to. We kind of talked about this a little bit about making change and little simple things that we do in our work to decolonize. What does that term mean to you as Indigenous scholars and curators? What does it look like in practice? And what is beyond that? What is the long end of decolonization for you? And I'd like to ask Felicia this.
All right, this is like something I love to talk about with all of my Indigenous museum colleagues, because I don't think there's a right answer. I don't think decolonization looks like any one way. And I like to think about it not as decolonization, but like as decolonial framework, as a way that we approach the work that we're doing, because I think putting it into the perspective that it's not something that has an endpoint, motivates us to keep going, and to understand that this is going to take a lot of work and a lot of effort, and we can approach anything with a decolonial framework. And I think that requires a lot of creativity and openness on the part of museum professionals, Indigenous or not. But yeah, I don't think that there is an endpoint. I don't think we're going to get to a place in time and say museums or academia is fully decolonized, our work is done. I think that we have to continue to reflect on these spaces and you know, the work that they do, and to think about it from a non-colonial perspective. And, you know, I think that's just going to continue to make these spaces better and, you know, more positive for us and our communities. I also just want to plug Museum of Us, Miranda's new place of work, a place of employment. I think that they have an incredible repatriation policy, and to me, I think that that is a really great example of, you know, a decolonial framework in practice. And Miranda, I would love for you to share a little bit about it.
Yeah, so, you know, I haven't really been able to jump in yet, but they have worked in the past. So they used to be the Museum of Man, and they did a whole decolonial assessment, like how do we get to a point that is no longer we center ourselves in coloniality. So they've changed it to the Museum of Us. They also have a whole decolonial initiative on the things that they're working on, and on their website towards, you know, making the space better for Indigenous people, particularly the Kumeyaay, whose land that they're on. Admission for anyone who's Indigenous is free. And also, if you buy a ticket, then you have a ticket for the year as a member. And they will also buy people tickets who have low income. So if you have low income, then they'll just waive the ticket fees for you. And so my work will be on helping students, young students, helping to build programs on how do they understand race, thinking of different ways of thinking, understand colonialism, and some big topics that we've all been talking about here. I'm making them adult and kid programs. And because I don't think that decolonization is possible, because in my head, colonization happened. There's no way to really move away. We're still in a colonial society, right? So, but there are ways that we can make these spaces more friendly. And I think that this new position will allow me to not mess with it, but bring new ways of thinking about all the things that we're talking about here onto actually practicing it. So that makes me really excited to be able to share it with all of you in time.
Amazing. Well, I'm going to be eagerly looking for what that's going to happen and what's going to be coming from that. So congratulations, Miranda. That's really exciting.
Congratulations. You?
I think for me, oh, go ahead, Paul.
No, I'm pointing at you with my chin. You can go, Elaine.
I think for me, the term decolonization, you know, is just for as Indigenous peoples to just be as we are, you know, to just live free and just to not have to explain ourselves and to just exist and to be the way that we want our communities to be and just to thrive and to, you know, it's just existing in a place where we could just be able to practice culturally who we are, whether it be on the land, you know, ceremonies, harvesting, hunting, you know, all that. And I think that's just really instrumental in for us to exist, and applying that to an institution, you know, it requires many different facets, but I feel like accommodating and doing things in ways that's really Indigenous specific and respects Indigenous ways of being is a really good way to start. It's a really good platform to raise that bar a little bit higher for us to be in. And, you know, I think it's for us, for me in my lifetime, you know, as long as I'm able to do as many things as possible to make safe spaces in places like museums for Indigenous peoples to come and thrive and be and, you know, express ourselves, then I feel that I've done some sort of contribution to that. So.
Right on. I think it's like pushing back against the possessiveness of Indigenous thing. Like everything we're talking about is like being objects of anything, being objectified, right? And yeah, I think about Eileen Morton Robinson's work as an important reading for settlers to unpack settler possessiveness, because it's permeates everything. It's an incredible, like, you know, force of like that permeates museums, it permeates the institutions of like, you know, objectifying and possessing our bodies, our language, our land, our relations, you know, resources, all these things, right? So, and I also want to talk, if I'm going to be a good academic, talk about Adam Gaudry and Lorenz, what's her name again? Danielle Lorenz, thank you. They wrote a great article called Indigenization as Inclusion, Inclusion, Reconciliation, and Decolonization for the Academy, but it works so well for the museums, right? Like, and I think they suggest two elements for decolonization is indigenization, right? So it's like, like treaty relations, everything that we're talking about, right? Making place for Indigenous sovereignty and, you know, Indigenous sovereignty and diplomacy, also resurgence-based decolonial practices. So like allowing for these things to flourish, right? It's a great article, and I often think through that lens of like, how do we make more space, more sovereign space for Indigenous nations, and that we're not objectifying all of these peoples, right? That Indigenous people are not this homogenous group. We're extremely plural within our nations and within between each other, right? And humans and more than human peoples have so much agency as well that we don't ever account for. So it becomes this complex thing for a settler society to comprehend, but I guess it takes a matter of walking with good intention, I guess, without it becoming as like, you know, settler, you know, move to innocence, right? That's always the danger. So yeah, so there's so much to unpack in these contexts, but I think if you center Indigenous sovereignty in the work, in the things, the spaces we have, I think that's a really good approach, right?
Absolutely, yeah. On that note, for settlers, what advice would you give to allies? I guess an extension would be like, what role does settlers play, you know, in this concept of, you know, unsettling?
It's super unsettling, right? To give up power and give up space and give up agency and give up knowledge. It's like the scariest thing to do, because Western epistemology is all built on the drive to one truth, right? And there's, in that sort of way of thinking, there's no way to acknowledge situated knowledges, right? So it becomes a really tough nut to crack. But you got to crack that nut, I guess.
That is exactly what I always say. Is I going back to this idea of, I don't know what it's like to have someone like me go into a place and be like, all right, you guys have been doing this all wrong, you know, and then like feeling like everything you've been working towards, your degrees, your quote unquote expertise is like shook, like almost, you know, like questioning all of a sudden. And then so I can imagine that that's just jarring, and that could be uncomfortable for a lot of people, and I hold space for that. But then at the same time, I think it's time that settlers mostly listen and actually listen, not just sit there and like absorb keywords like decolonization, but really have that, like we've been saying, reflective quality of thinking about like, how have we benefited from Indigenous removal? How have I been harmful towards Indigenous people? Do I really know this history? Have I really done my homework? And not feeling threatened by our presence or who we are and what we're saying. Because again, we're going to say things that people don't agree with. Like you were saying, Elaine, like there was a time where I told one of our collections people, then be open on the weekends for community members because they're working 9 to 5. They can't come into the museum. And being told, well, we can't open anything on the weekends because we don't get paid for that. Well, that's not right. Then you're not really being a collaborator. You're not really trying to work with our communities. We work for free all the time, right? Like you're saying, and it's not even work. It's just what we do. So I think that there needs to be an assessment of actually sitting and thinking, am I really trying to help collaborate and bring change? Or am I just saying that so that way it's, you know, I'm being politically correct in front of my friends and my family and the people I work with, and being humble with a good heart, because I'm always telling myself that. My ancestors will make sure if I'm not being humble, they'll remind me several times over. And so being humble and having a good heart and making mistakes, it's all going to be okay.
Beautifully put. I think for the context for here in Alberta, not just Alberta, but Canada too, is like reminding folks that here, you know, this nation could not exist without treaties. In some places, you know, there hasn't been treaties. In some places, you know, they're unceded lands, and recognizing that history. And in order for settlers to be in this place, you know, they were part of treaty too. They are in a treaty relationship with this existing place that they need to think about and learn about and know what to do to be better neighbors.
Yeah, I think on like along those same lines, Elaine, you mentioned this earlier about like how much work it is to be an Indigenous person existing in these spaces. The work that we do is you know, it's not just a job, it's an extension of who we are. And we don't just get to go home at the end of the day and stop thinking about work or, you know, hang it at the door and forget about it. It's something that we are constantly like preoccupied with, and it's exhausting. And I think settler allies can really start by listening, like you all said. I think that's the first step, but also be an advocate when there are no Indigenous people in the room. I find that a lot of times as land acknowledgements are becoming more popular, this is just one example, people, non-Native people will only give land acknowledgements for events that have to do with an Indigenous topic or an Indigenous speaker, but are not doing it for other events. And it's, to me, it's like, Indigenous people are not the ones that need to be hearing this and doing this work. You know, I think we can all constantly be working, but I think that settlers need to, you know, truly invest in these issues and advocate for, you know, the things that we care about, even when we aren't there to listen or to hold them accountable.
There's just to kind of add further to that, Felicia, you've done your master's thesis work on the importance and relevance of land acknowledgements. Can you be able to speak a little bit more about, you know, why is it necessary? Why people need to step up and start, you know, contextualizing their place and privilege and, you know, in acknowledging the land that they're on?
Yeah, of course. I think for me, it was really frustrating to, you know, go through these spaces. I went to grad school in New York with, you know, some of the most well-known museums in the world. And it was really frustrating to see how poorly Indigenous people were represented or how they were not represented at all in these spaces. And to me, that signified, you know, what a basic kind of starting point museums are at. And I'm sure anyone watching this conversation can see how much work there is to be done, and it can be very daunting. And I think a lot of people, a lot of settlers wonder, like, how do you even start that work? Like, where do you begin to heal and repair? And I think land acknowledgements are a really important first step. Like you all said, you know, we have kinship with the land and place and, you know, everything around us. And our relationships to land and territory are, you know, one of the most central parts of who we are as people and as community. And I think if settlers can begin to understand that and respect that, they can move forward in a good way to start to build better relationships between themselves and these institutions and us and our communities.
Beautiful.
I was going to say too, I should plug the Indigenous Canada MOOC at this point, because it's a free course that anyone can do, and it is 12 modules that really sort of give you a basis for Indigenous 101 kind of thing. So Indigenous experience of history and contemporary experiences. So it's a great course for people who, because I think sometimes people don't know what to do or what to say or what questions to ask, and it's just because it's Indigenous peoples have been erased from all of settler colonials. All of, like, it becomes this place devoid of Indigenous relations and peoples. And I think a course like Indigenous Canada helps repopulate the settler imagination, I think, with like that. These relations are extremely meaningful and forever meaningful, and they continue to be meaningful. It's not because industrialization has come in that erased indigenous people from the face of the earth, you know, like there's still so much, like there's still deep relations that happen all over Canada as a nation state, or the US. And it's time to just wake up to those relations. But that takes so much work. So take the course, take the MOOC, as Chris, my boss, would say. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's amazing to see how much it's grown just in the course of the year, let alone
Yeah, absolutely.
when did it launch?
It launched in 2017. So, and it's the collaborative work of led by Dr. Tracy Bear, who's now moving from the Faculty of Native Studies to McMaster. So we're sending her off with love. But she's the person. It's like her labor of bringing all of the different elements of the faculty's specializations into this course. So it's a collaborative work. It reflects Indigenous relations and ways of seeing things instead of being objects of study. So it's a great course that has really been the turning point for the people have turned to it for it's like, it's not a culture course, it's like an Indigenous experience, sorry, expression of Indigenous experiences, you know what I mean? So that's what makes it quite unique. So
Amazing.
yeah.
So I hope
And
after this that you're going to see some sparks in enrollment and
yeah, you bet.
people signing up, and it's a really great first step in understanding your place in Indigenous relations.
That's right. And women's labor too. Like that's the thing with Tracy. It's like so many Indigenous women are doing the work of that communication. Like look around the room right now, right? It's Indigenous women who are leading the way. And I think that's really important to recognize in terms of our course and museums right now. So merci everyone around the room for this work. Holy man. Jeez Louise.
And thank
Hot
you for
stuff,
your
you guys.
Well, you led it to the end, Paul. So I guess in closing, my final question in reflection with all of you. So, museums, universities, and colleges, there's growing number of people, Indigenous people entering these spaces, either as students, as faculty, as researchers, curators, collection managers, directors. What is your dream for the future of these spaces for our people, for your Indigenous people?
I guess I'll go.
Okay, go.
Okay.
I don't want to be last.
You can go if you want.
Should I go first? I'll
Yeah,
go
you
first, and then I'll make space for everyone here. I honestly think like our institutions should be these visiting places, these places which means that it's open and non-oppressive, like that each of our institutions in which we work and live are like these places that we can feel comfortable to bring our families into, and that takes a lot of like expunging the power relations that are implicit with settler colonialism. Like it's such a dominant discourse that like that is the thing that needs to the most work to massage into. That's how you make spaces that we can come in and visit and have fun together, and then therefore make these places sacred again, or as we work, so yeah, for me it's about making these places safe for visiting. If that happens and you're not kicked out for being too loud, then you're doing great. It's that simple, right? Or maybe it's more complicated.
My hope, and I love that, is that they are sites of healing, that they are sites of no longer producing trauma for our people, that hopefully whenever I have kids and they have kids and the next few generations can go in and see themselves reflected in a way that feels much more of their own experience, of their lived experience, but and also that those cultural items that can go home, because some items can't. There's some things that are no longer, some tribes can't take them back, or that's not tribally appropriate, or things like that, but that they are all taken care of in the ways that they deserve to be taken care of, and then the ways that they want to be taken care of. They do want to be held and touched and cried with and laughed with and joked with and teased with. And so being able to provide a space where that's more easily done for all of us, I think is what my future goals would be.
Yes, just like really, really beautiful sentiments. I feel like what I have to say is pretty much the same, but I always say that my vision for museums is for Indigenous people to be able to go in these spaces and both see themselves but feel seen. You know, I want these to be places that, you know, are healing but also support us and, you know, only uplift us further. I think that that is what I hope, that's what I think about in my work, and that's what I hope for the future of these spaces.
Beautifully put. I find, you know, these potential spaces can be, again, like reiterating what Miranda was saying, you know, healing and uplifting. And, you know, for me, it's like a site of reconnection. You know, for some, I'm speaking like from my community and from my region, like reconnecting items of our ancestors, you know, with some of their living descendants. And, you know, that in itself is like, you know, we're on a path to resurging not just skills, but also knowledge and relationships that is embedded within these things. And so to me, I'd like to see, you know, the same, you know, it being a safe space for us to thrive, not just as communities and as people, but, you know, as Indigenous peoples embedded within places like museums and post-secondary. We rightfully should be there. And that's going to make a world of difference. And I look forward to when that happens. So, so with that, I would like to say thank you to each and every one of you. It was been just such a wonderful conversation. You know, us exchanging and sharing what our ideas were on this matter of, you know, unsettling colonial institutions, what it means for better representation for Indigenous peoples. And I really hope our audiences had time to reflect and to listen and to, you know, think about what is the next step? What is the next step for you in helping achieve better representation for Indigenous peoples? So thank you to everyone, all of our panelists. I will pass this off over to Ravi, who is going to, you know, have some closing words for you. Masicho, thank you.
Inash.
Thank you, Elaine. Well, I hope everyone found that insightful and a basis for reflection. There's a few people that I'd like to thank. I'd like to thank Miranda, Paul, and Felicia for taking time out of their busy schedules to partake in this discussion. And it's been, I think we started planning this in February, so it's been a long time trying to get everyone's schedules arranged and worked out. I'd like to thank Elaine again for being an excellent moderator. I think, I don't know, Elaine, this must be maybe the 4th or 5th presentation that we've all worked on together. You're the expert. So, and I'd also like to thank you for introducing me to the podcast that Miranda and Felicia host called Exhibiting Kinships that can be found, as far as I know, on Spotify and Apple. And I would highly recommend people go in and listen. It's very, very good. Paul, thank you for taking my call when I reached out to you. That was very nice. And thank you for participating in this. And hopefully you get more people registering for the course. I'd also like to thank two of our friends, members, Jessica and Drew, for working in the background to make sure everything went off without a hitch. And with that, I would bid everyone a good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight.